PixelPipes is made possible by the support of viewers like you. If you enjoy the content that we do, consider clicking the join button below and becoming a PixelPipes member. Your contributions will help support the continued growth of this channel. It's always fun to think about what-if scenarios. What if 3DFX were still around today? What if Intel had kept making graphics cards after 1998? What if AMD hadn't bought ATI, and so on and so forth. But there's one what if in particular that begs to be the focus of today's topic. What if the FX 5800 Ultra had been, well, good? This is PixelPipes. So we've talked a lot about the GeForce FX 5800 Ultra, NVIDIA's flagship graphics card from early 2003 that brought about DirectX 9 support and why it was such a huge disappointment. It had an awful cooler, it performed poorly in newer shader-heavy games, and it was released way late with nearly non-existent production. I won't belabor the point too much more. If you want to know more in-depth detail on what went wrong, I'll leave links to my previous videos for you to check out. So instead, we're going to keep things simple. I'm going to assume you already know something about the FX 5800 Ultra, and instead, we're going to turn our attention towards the question at hand. Had the FX 5800 Ultra been released on time with good performance and lived up to the story its specs told on paper, how would things have changed? Well, armchair market analysis aside, we can at least show you how it could have performed had its inherent architectural flaws been averted. And for that, we need to look at the next generation of cards to follow, NVIDIA's GeForce 6 Series. The GeForce 6 Series focused primarily on fixing the problems that saddled the FX series. In many ways, you might think of it as what the FX series should have been. It was still very much derived from that older, shakier architecture, but was beefed up in the areas of pixel shading performance and fill rates. The flagship of the line, the 6800 Ultra, was touted as being as much as 8 times faster in pixel shading performance. This wasn't just a generational leap for NVIDIA, this was a complete turnaround. And much like how the FX's problems precipitated down the entire product stack, the strengths of the GeForce 6 series would see its lower tier models performing similarly exceptional. And that brings us to this card, the GeForce 6600 GT. This was NVIDIA's $200 mid-range card, back when mid-range cards cost that much, and would launch in September of 2004. Generally, a mid-range card would shoot for about half the performance of the top-of-the-line cards, but in many ways, the 6600 GT would overperform this target. The 6600 GT cut the 16 PixelPipes of its high-end cousin in half, as you might expect. However, the GPU would be built on a smaller 110nm manufacturing process, versus the 130 the bigger chip used. Being that it was also a smaller overall design with fewer transistors meant that NVIDIA could clock it substantially higher, at 500 MHz. For the memory, NVIDIA would utilize the new GDDR3 type, allowing them to clock it at 1 GHz effectively with little issue in the way of yields or cost. The memory interface was cut in half compared to the 6800 class cards at 128 bits, resulting in a bandwidth of 16 GB per second. Overall, it was a speedy package for the money, but what's remarkable is how well these specs line up with a certain older generation flagship. The 5800 Ultra was also clocked at 500 MHz on its core, and using much more expensive DDR2 memory, clocked its VRAM at 1 GHz on a 128-bit bus. The card only had 4 PixelPipes, mind you, which NVIDIA fudged the specs on a number of occasions. Again, there's another video if you want to know more about that, but once again that ties together with the issues surrounding the FX series. In 2003, it should have had 8 pipes, and in 2004, a little mid-range card that would be its spiritual successor did. So what kind of difference did that make? Wouldn't it be fun to compare the two and see what could have been? For some reason, I've amassed something of a collection of these 6600 GTs. Not sure how that happened, but we have a few PCI Express cards, the native form of this model, and a couple bridged AGP cards that would come out a little later. For whatever reason, the AGP versions clock their memory at 900 MHz, but can do 1 GHz just fine, so I tend to set it to that when testing, and this time was no exception. The AGP version is the card of choice since we can share the same test platform between the two. Now, that being said, in some tests I recycled results for the 5800 Ultra from my older card battles video, which used a different platform, as it didn't make sense to retest games that were completely GPU bound. Otherwise, older, more CPU sensitive games as well as some brand new tests were all done on the newer platform. Here at PixelPipes, we intentionally use overpowered CPUs and newer, but not always the newest drivers, which are more mature and perform better than what was available at the time of launch, in order to get as close to each graphics card's true potential performance as possible. Please check the video description for test system details. Starting off with a legacy test in 3D Mark 01, we see the 6600 GT ahead by close to 3,000 points, which is only about an 11% difference between the two. But then when we introduce shaders into the mix, the difference increases drastically to about 48% in favor of the 6600 GT. Focusing mainly on DirectX 9 shaders with 3D Mark 05, the difference becomes laughable, with more than 3 times the performance between the two. In Aqua Mark III, the 6600 GT holds a commanding lead in this DirectX 8 test, with about a 33% better score. In the second encounter, we introduce some AA and AF testing into the mix. Without those features enabled, the cards are fairly close together, going well into unnecessarily high frame rates. With AA and AF enabled, the difference grows to about 51% in average frame rates in favor of the GT, though the 5800 Ultra still runs it smooth. Unreal Tournament 2004 shows stiff rivalry between the two, as shaders aren't being utilized and the 8 total texture units in the 5800 Ultra are able to shine. However, if we look at the 1% lows, something strange is going on with the 6600 GT. If we look at a plot of the frame rates, the frame times are littered with horrible latency spikes, and watching the game in motion you can see some pretty horrid stuttering. I tried a newer driver and it wasn't affected, so I guess in some games and on some platforms, the AGP version of the 6600 GT might exhibit some frame time issues. Halo has no such problems, and here the 6600 GT mops the floor with the old vacuum cleaner. Painkiller with the Shader Model 3.0 patch applied flexes the GT's muscle, showing slightly over double the performance in averages. Once again, the 1% lows don't look very good for either card, but this is due to hitches caused by heavy use of the Havoc physics engine. Far Cry is another shader-heavy test, and once again the difference is night and day, with over double the performance. The streak continues in Half-Life 2, with another clear win for the 6600 GT, and I must remind everyone that FX series cards are forced to run in DirectX 8 mode in this game, making the 5800 Ultra's loss all the more embarrassing. Doom 3 is just about double the performance, and the game featured on the fan shroud of the 6600 GT was clearly justified, showing a very smooth and enjoyable experience. And then for a torture test from 2005, we have Fear, running with almost max settings, which shows the 6 series card getting a massive lead of over 3 times the average frame rates. It should be noted though that these settings exceeded the frame buffer size of the card, and 1% lows suffer as a result with occasional hitching as textures have to be swapped. Then, averaging the performance between the 8 games, the lead for the 6600 GT is even out between the newer and older tests, with a 58% lead in the averages, though the 1% lows are a lot closer thanks to the GT's occasional frame time issues. And though we only tested 3 games with AA and AF, here is the average between them, with average frame rates of 43% higher for the 6600 GT, slightly closer than they were without AA and AF. And just for fun, here are a few tests with results from the Radeon 9700 Pro thrown in, most of which were taken from the card battles video I did a while back comparing it to the 5800 Ultra. Well, that was a slaughterfest. But really it's no surprise. While the clock speed, fill rates, and memory bandwidth are matched, the architecture is massively improved on the 6600 GT, and this is simply the result of that. There are improvements in memory bandwidth efficiency and vertex processing, moving from 2 vertex processors in the 5800 Ultra to 3 in the 6600 GT, but most of the improvements come from the robust pixel shader engine within the G46 architecture. In games that don't leverage pixel shading, performance was often similar between the two. And had the 6600 GT been the flagship card of 2003, it would have destroyed ATI's Radeon 9700 Pro in most cases, and even the 9800 Pro and 9800 XT would have had an uphill battle. With all of NVIDIA's success throughout the GeForce line, not having stumbled during the FX generation would have only cemented their lead further, and ATI wouldn't have seen the boom in sales and market share that they enjoyed during the DirectX 9 era. It's difficult to say if they would have been able to stick it out as perpetual underdogs for that much longer. But speculation is anyone's game. The fact remains the GeForce FX did get released, and truthfully, it probably happened the only way it could have. The NV30 GPU inside the 5800 Ultra was already the biggest ever made to that point at 125 million transistors, almost 20 million more than ATI, and yet it was difficult to manufacture. The NV43 inside the 6600 GT is 146 million transistors large, and was only possible thanks to the advances in chip manufacturing that took place in the year between their releases. A 6600 GT in 2003 may have simply not been feasible. That brings this topic to a close, I think. I hope you enjoyed this little exploration, and look forward to seeing the 6600 GT again in the future when we compare it against its rival, the Radeon X700 Pro. It should be an interesting battle. As for the 5800 Ultra, it's a card I clearly love to talk about. Over the multiple videos I've made featuring it, there's one conclusion I think we can definitively make. Train wrecks are fun to look at. Discussions on history often dwell on failures, and this is no exception. But I think it's safe to lay this one to rest now. I've gotten a lot of joy out of it, even if I might have developed tinnitus in the process. But I'm actually going to be parting ways with my 5800 Ultra. It's been a holy grail of mine to own, but now that I've gotten to own it and gotten to experience using it, testing it, and sharing it with the public in a way it never was before, I am content. Hopefully its future owner gets as much joy out of it as I have. As always, thank you very much for watching. Keep it glued to this channel for more on the history of 3D computer graphics. And until then, I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes. A very warm thanks goes out to my YouTube membership supporters. I'd like to give a very special shout out to my shader level supporters especially, Chris W, Cutting Ed Retro, and Sucra. Thank you guys for being so awesome. And if you'd like to support PixelPipes directly, there's no better way than to join my membership. Click the join button under this video and help the channel continue bringing the content you enjoy.